Yes, friends. It is the One Giant Podcast, of course, where you know we are your host. Over here, Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the Brooklyn Nets and the Locked On Nets podcast. And yonder there is the season generational ticket holder, the healthy, wealthy, and wise, the well-rested Mr. Andrew Mankiewicz.
Adam, this episode is not about me. It's not. It's about a happy belated birthday to my co-host, Adam Armbrecht, over the Thanksgiving break. Although the Giants didn't get you the win that you would have liked for your birthday weekend, I'm sure that you still had a great time.
You better believe it, man. We don't need to divulge who's getting older around here. But it was nice and relaxing. Got to see some family, got to spend some time, obviously, with my significant other, and as we refer to affectionately on the podcast, live-in lover Courtney. We had ourselves a nice little quiet weekend. Thank you very much, sir, for that. I'm getting emotional here, going to tear up over here on the podcast. Thought I was going to just blast out. Listen, we're coming off a bit of a nice little bit of a holiday for the podcast. We intentionally gave ourselves some time off, and I got to get back into the reps here because I almost just blasted a sneeze clean across this podcast that would have broken the eardrums of fans and viewers alike. Andy, are you ready for this podcast, though? Because if I find that you're sleeping and maybe you don't want to get you don't want to quite wake up for it, I'll turn this podcast around. Turn this podcast around and we'll go right back to the start.
I am fired up. Because I think from what I hear, the season starts today, Adam. That's what I keep hearing from people. I've heard it in different circles. And so the podcast starts today, my friend.
Podcast starts today. Jesus, we've been wasting a lot of our time then this season so far. That's what Brian Dable said. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the episode. First and foremost, just a few brief minutes. As we said, we didn't come in after. We're enjoying time with our family. That was the intention, the point, and we chose to do that for the Thanksgiving Day game. Just from a high level, Andy, were you disappointed in Thursday night? Were you disappointed in the fact that the Giants lost? We knew they were decimated by injuries. We know it was going to be a tough game no matter what. Coming out of that game, did you feel any differently about this team per se? Did you have any big takeaways?
So I going into it, my prediction was that the Cowboys would win 27-10. It was 28-13 with about a minute or two to go. So it was kind of in the realm where I thought the game would get a little bit out of reach in the third quarter was kind of my sentiment there. Listen, it felt like a game that the Cowboys almost coughed up to the Giants. It felt like there was an opportunity maybe midway through the game into the third quarter where the Giants
winning had a chance. Halftime.
Yeah, right
winning
around
the game at halftime, Andrew.
Well, I'm saying 13-7, obviously we're winning, but I'm saying into the third quarter, you're thinking we have a legitimate chance. Sometimes when you're up a field goal, you're like, it's just a matter of time. Here, it felt like the Giants had a legitimate opportunity. There were a couple plays that didn't go their way. Obviously, the ludicrous illegal man downfield on the 24-yard touchdown pass to Isaiah Hodgins. How on earth do you call that? The guy's literally blocking his man, and the other guy backs up, and he's like, well, I was just engaged here, and now you're gone. What am I supposed to do? That would have been a huge one on 2nd and 17 for the Giants to get up early with a touchdown. Instead, they have to settle for a field goal. Game could have been, 16-7. It could have been higher up if the Giants were able to take advantage of some of those bigger mistakes and turnovers that plagued the Cowboys early on in the game.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a high level here as we look forward, but just specifically on this game, man, I called for the Giants to win. I was going for the feel-good story on Thanksgiving, right? And hey, listen, recover an onside kick maybe gets really spicy at the end there, but ultimately, what I said coming into this game and reflecting on some of the matchups the Giants have going forward, you look inside the box score, man. Ezekiel Elliott, 16 for 92. Pollard, 18 for 60 in this one. Go inside the receiving numbers. Lamb, 6 for 106. 5 for 63 for Gallup, right? Ferguson chips in. And then Schultz, who actually, we didn't even talk about it leading up to this one. He has been he's kind of like the new Jason Witten for the Dallas Cowboys when it comes to playing the Giants. 4 catches, 31 yards, 2 touchdowns. The point being here is these are the things that I've been worried about for this team from week 1 all the way up to this point. I said it coming into this game, said it really throughout this season. Wait until you play competent, healthy quarterbacks that have a complement of weapons at both the running back and the wide receiver room. Saw it in the first meeting when they lost. You saw it again in this one. This is, I think, what could be alarming for the New York Football Giants going forward, because you're going to face a lot of kind of models like this. And I think it's just going to expose the Giants fan base to the reality. Played a lot of good football, been very competitive, been very well coached, and also the talent level you just see the disparity and you see where these matchups are going to really hurt the Giants.
Yeah, and you see it on the outside for the Giants in the wide receiver room. It's really hard for them to get separation. You see it that one of the lowest separation rates in the league outside Darius Slayton. Like he's the only one that seems to be able to get open with any relative consistency.
Richie
It
James
was
right back on track in this one, by the way.
he had to pop in, Well,
5 for 41.
it goes to show that the scheme is very like plug and play. It's just if you get more elite talent in those spots, they can do more, they can make more happen, they can make electric plays happen. 5 for 41. It felt like that's kind of the stat line that Wildell Robinson lived in when healthy. Listen, this was not a great game for Saquon Barkley. It feels like since the bye week, he has really struggled to get things going. Now, is it the offensive line? Is it that teams are just stacking the box saying you're not going to beat us? There's rumors swirling that maybe he's a little dinged up. Maybe he's a little frustrated about not getting the contract. Yeah, there's a whole host of things that could be causing it. But the Giants aren't going to be winning many football games against a top 5 defense if Saquon Barkley's going 11 for 39 yards on the ground. Like there's just no way that they can win that game if he's not manufacturing yards to keep time of possession, but also help move the ball down the field.
Yeah, and it's one of those things like you go inside, and we obviously understand they're missing 3/5 of the starting lineup. They're rotating guys through. It's going to create a little bit of a lack of continuity. We talked coming into this one even about Mike Kafka and how creative is he being on the offensive side of the ball. Are you, if Saquon, if it's not quite working right now, are you bringing in some other players that can give you opportunities like Matt Breida, which they did do, by the way, in this game? It's just that, again, this is one of those examples too, and we're almost moving away from this game now. Something else that I've talked about with this team over the course of the season. Again, this is a Daniel Jones, 228, 21 to 35, comes out with a 61.7 QBR, only took 3 sacks in this game, had a touchdown. I said Breed, I meant Brightwell ends up spelling Saquon a little bit, 5 for 31. Maybe you lean into that a little bit more, right? Maybe you try to just use the other players here and get rotational. Only 11 carries in this game for Saquon Barkley, but it's just the theme here, right? When the game gets to a point where it's more about the passing attack than the running attack, the Giants don't have the ability right now, whether personnel, skill set, talent, etc., to be able to take over a game and go from 13-7 to 20-7 to 20-10 to 26 to, they can't keep pushing that margin. There's always something that kind of holds them back a little bit. And I think as we look forward over the course of the rest of this season, it's going to be the theme, because you're going to mention now as we get into the injury updates around this roster and hopefully what makes Giants fans feel a little bit more confident. But I don't know if health is enough here. It still comes down to, even at the full strength health of this team, you're talking about playing a very different slate of teams here over the back half of the season, a lot of which have playoff implications for us and for the teams we're going against.
Well, we mentioned in the lead up to the Cowboys game on Thanksgiving that a lot of the players were very close to being able to come back at them. They were a couple days away, and what the coaching staff and the training staff thought was, if it was a Sunday game, maybe they could have played, maybe they could have given it a shot. We kind of suggested, the Cowboys game, you can't have any losses on the schedule where you just kind of write it off. But at the same time, you kind of look and say, the games moving forward are critical to have these players back and healthy. If we sit them for the Thanksgiving game, then they get another almost 10 days off to get healthy. And if they're that close, then all of a sudden we can get them back out there ready to go.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And also, like, the fully honest statement is, we're not good enough to beat the Dallas Cowboys, so we're not going to risk some of the players that aren't ready to come back. And I'm not even saying that negatively. We're not good enough to beat them. And you can go back and look at that game and, to your point, say, well, they were winning. It could have been whatever. Like, just bottom line, because you're in the division. And when you go back and you look at that, it wasn't a must-win game. And we talked about that going in too. But you lost that game, and Dallas moves into position number 2 in the division. They elevate themselves in that wild card, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And now the real pressure, the season all begins now with the Washington Commanders. Right. But if you had gone out and won the game against Dallas, you'd already be in a better spot. You would have split the season series. Now, the remainder of the season really would have come down to who plays better down the stretch, Dallas or New York. That's a first wild card spot versus a third wild card spot. So I do think there's a little bit of, let's go ahead and just frame this in a way where the fact that we didn't think we were going to have a chance to beat the Cowboys that doesn't really matter. It does. It's just that this is where the Giants are right now, and it sets up for a very important game this week and going forward. But let's stay on those injuries here and why maybe the Giants have a better shot.
Yeah, so the injury report, and this comes from Jordan Renan, just clearly stating this out. And he came out with a tweet yesterday that basically just said it's entirely possible the Giants get 7 players back for this big game versus the Commanders. And here, I'm going to list these names to you, and I'll pose a question afterwards.
All right.
Guard, Ben Bredesen. Right tackle, Evan Neal. Center, John Feliciano. Tight end, Daniel Bellinger. Outside linebacker / edge rusher, Azeez Ojulari. Cornerback, Fabian Moreau. Safety, Tony Jefferson. All have a legitimate chance to play in this game against the Commanders. Those 7 players, does that, hearing that, encourage you? We know that some of them were close. Do you feel more confident in the Giants' abilities if you're getting 7 potential starters back across the 22 that start in the game?
Oh, of course. I mean, listen, of course, we've talked about whether or not, is Bredesen the answer, not the answer. He's played far better this season than we thought he was going to coming into the year, certainly. The Evan Neal one, that really matters to me, obviously. Now he's a funny one because long-term we love him. Short-term, we know that it's still a process for him. So, it's funny to think about Phillips has been playing out there and been serviceable, right? Some of the other guys that have stepped in. Now, when you get to the point when you're starting Matt Pert, we know we have some concerns. So yes, it obviously elevates it. The Azeez Ojulari one, I think, is the most critical across this right now because we're seeing Kayvon Thibodeau get closer. He's almost getting home. It reminds me of talking about Leonard Williams 2 seasons ago when you and I were trying to convince Giants fans, listen, pressures matter. It's not just about the sacks, right? There's more happening here than just that one statistical category. And by and large, everyone is leaning into that with Thibodeau saying, hey, he has the most pressures among all rookies this season. He's just not getting home yet, but once he does, watch out. I don't know if it's going to be Thibodeau, but if it can be Azeez Ojulari that gets home because of how good Thibodeau is coming on here, that's great too. That's getting pressure. That's getting home. The only concern I have as far as does it elevate my belief in what this team can accomplish is that we have had stretches where Thibodeau and Ojulari have been healthy and Leonard Williams and Dexter Lawrence. And the defense hasn't fully got there. And that's when you get to that secondary and Moreau and whether or not you think this defense in the absence of Xavier McKinney can force those turnovers, right? That was the big one too. Last couple of weeks, not getting the big turnovers when you really needed them in the big spot. So I still think, yes, it elevates my belief this team can go out and win games. But as we said all along, it's 1 possession games all year. So this is about whether or not you can get that one key turnover when you need it. Like, it's very rare that you can legitimately point to one play in every game. But I think you really could with the Giants sometimes and say, just off the hands of a defensive lineman, could have been an interception. Okay, could have been a fumble recovery, but it gets back to the offensive team. Those little moments really do dictate the way these games go for Big Blue.
It feels like this boost and influx of players is coming at the most critical time for the Giants.
Of course.
You have the Detroit Lions, you've got the bye week, you got the Thanksgiving game. The Giants have lost, 3 out of 4 games. They're kind of in a little bit of a tailspin. They need talent out there because it feels like, a lot of these games that they have lost recently, it's because they were the less talented team on the field. And when you start out in that position, you have to overcome a lot of obstacles in order to not only be competitive, but have a shot to win the game. And so when you think about who's coming back, when you talk about Bredesen, Neal, Feliciano, Bellinger, I won't go through the whole list, but of those 7, 6 are legitimate starters on this team. 6 of 22 guys are actual starters on the team. So when you think about it, that's over 25% of the starting roster comes back. And Adam, that in and of itself would be huge to get over 25% of your starting roster back. But it also means that the depth that you have and the ability to scheme and move players around becomes better because with Bredesen there, then you're not necessarily relying on Azudu or Matt Pert on the right tackle or Tyree Phillips. You actually have the ability to kind of see what's going on and scheme for specifically what you need. And I think that's the biggest part is when one hand's behind the back, how are these coordinators supposed to scheme when they don't have the players out there?
I agree. And also, if Saquon Barkley isn't 100% healthy, if he's laboring a bit here, if it's not just the fact that you're missing guys on the offensive line this past game specifically, guess what? If he is not, this is the other part of it. If he's not turning it in every single week with lights out performances, this team isn't going to win, right? So like that's another big part of this too. We're now seeing, and this isn't even this is not Daniel Jones specific here, but when you don't have the balance, when you don't have the powerhouse guy in the backfield, when he's not clicking on all cylinders, you're going to lose games more often than not. And I agree with what you're saying. Listen, it's all better. Being healthier is better. But what is the healthiest version of this team compared to the healthiest version of the Washington Commanders, right? It goes back into this. They have a lot of weapons at wide receiver. They have a lot of different options at running back. The rookie Robinson is coming on now these last couple of games. And you're hearing that Chase Young, he's sniffing around, getting himself back out there on the field. So from a defensive standpoint, they're going to have some weapons there as well. It makes it very, very interesting, man. And I'll be fascinated. Honestly, I'm very curious to see how this team comes out, because now we are, as you mentioned there, losing 3 out of the last 4 games. Listen, you can live with most of them. The Detroit one is certainly disappointing and frustrating. But it does feel like the team is right on the edge of coming back to the mean here over the course of this entire season. And who knows? Now you can, prove me wrong. I won't put you in this category of like, then go out and beat Washington, and all of a sudden it starts to go, and you think about these matchups against Philadelphia, et cetera. But I mean, really, dude, even 100% healthy, are you brimming with confidence having to play Washington twice, Philly twice, and the Minnesota Vikings over the next several weeks?
Well, so I would like to take a pause and talk about Saquon Barkley, because you brought up a really good point about him. He is the engine that goes. We know that Daniel Jones has been playing better this year than we had seen in previous years, but we know this offense runs through Saquon. We saw it when they handed him the ball 35 times, and you're like, NFL running backs don't get the ball 35 times. The Giants need him to be productive in order to be successful. It sets up everything. Adam, in the 3 games where the least 3 rushing yard games for Saquon Barkley, the Giants have lost all of those games. So
Yeah.
when you think about, like, if he's not going, it ruins everything for the offense. It could be because of limitations with Daniel Jones. It could be because the wide receiving core is injured. It could be because the wide receiving core doesn't have talent. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. If Saquon doesn't get going, this team historically will lose the game. And so that's why it's so important to figure out how to make sure that he's either A, healthy, or we get him in positions to be successful, because he had 39 yards against the Cowboys, 22 yards against the Lions, and 53 yards against the Seahawks. We lost all 3. It's not a recipe for success. The Giants can't overcome him not being Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, and I'll just go back over to here, because actually I want to ask this question, which ties back into a just chef's kiss performance from the Denver Broncos on Monday Night Football. We'll get a little bit far afield before we tap into that Brian Dable quote around the season starts now. Daniel Jones, you said losing 3 out of these last 4. Now, again, the talent all matters here, but there's games when it looks good and with or without. Again, take away if you're talking about drops where that's very clearly can be a 1-to-1 correlation. But there's been plenty of games where the wide receiver core is functioning even without great separation. In these last 4 games, when they've gone 1-3, 2 of his worst QBR ratings have come out of these last 4 games. Against Seattle, a 23. Against Detroit, a 37.6. And by the way, the 37.6 comes in a game when Daniel Jones throws the ball 44 times, 341 yards, 2 interceptions. We can litigate, one being bad or one's a throwaway, whatever the case may be. But it's a fact, right? They win that game against Houston, 83.7 QBR for Daniel Jones. Interestingly enough, a 61.7 in the loss to Dallas, right? A close game that could have been a little bit closer. When he throws for over 200 yards, the Giants tend to lose those games. When he throws for under 200 yards and uses his legs a little bit more, the Giants tend to win those games. And it all ties back to Saquon Barkley or whoever you have in the backfield. And just to, again, since we're coming from a long layover here, coming off of this game with the Denver Broncos on Monday night, where Russell Wilson is what you call a disaster. And the Denver Broncos not only paid him $250,000, but also traded away tons of capital to get him. It does beget that question around like this price point conversation that we've kind of had all year. And it's for the offseason, and we'll see how it shakes out. But while it won't be $40 to $50 million, committing big numbers financially to the quarterback position and having it not work out is a death nail. Arizona's dealing with it right now with Kyler Murray. The Denver Broncos are literally in a worst case scenario watching a top 4 pick right now go to Seattle. This is that global concern, and why I think Joe Schoen and the Giants why I've said all along, wins and losses be damned. You need to continue the evaluation process of not just Daniel Jones, but of Saquon Barkley and of every key position you might pay money to this offseason. Because if you commit dollars in the wrong place, see ya 4 years from now when the Giants will be trying to reboot this thing once again. It's just something, from a high level that clicked in my mind here while we're sitting around waiting for the Giants to play more football.
Yeah, it is an interesting situation at the quarterback position. Obviously, you and I sometimes differ on our perspective on Daniel Jones.
And let me just really quick say, Daniel Jones is having a far better season than Russell Wilson is. Daniel Jones is trending in the upward direction, not plummeting to the bottom of a canyon here. So it's not a one-to-one QB comparison. It's just this idea of committing dollars, right? And that's the only thing here. And there's a world where we're only building closer and closer to saying you can feel pretty comfortable in whatever that number turns out to be committing it to Daniel Jones.
Yeah, and I think when you see the massive numbers of these big time guys, the Russell Wilsons, the Aaron Rodgers, the Kyler Murrays, they're making 40 something plus a year, and when they're not the force multiplier that they need to be, the team is just hamstrung, right? Like they can't do anything. And I think that's why Giant fans in particular have said, if we want to have Daniel Jones, it has to be at more of a reasonable number. It has to be at that $25 million a year type number, maybe not 5, 6, 7 years like they gave Russell Wilson, just because you can't, like, it's so risky to sign these quarterbacks to big long-term deals that you have to be really careful with the money. And so, I think with quarterback play, it is interesting. The other thing I will say is the Giants are going to be in an interesting spot because the fact that they are winning games is going to push them down the draft order. So when you also think about where they're going to be drafting, I think the Entertainer on Twitter, if you don't follow him, I recommend him as a follow. He does a lot of good Giants work. He basically broke it down and was like 4 out of 6, if not 5 out of 6 of the top 6 picks are going to be looking for quarterbacks in this draft. So if the Giants plan on going to get a quarterback, they are going to have to trade a king's ransom for one particular guy. And so, like,
depending on how the rest of the season goes.
Well, I mean, even right now, the Giants have 7 wins. 7 will still put them at the 10th or 11th pick historically. So, like, if you want to get up into the top 3 and you want to get past QB needy teams, like, you would have to give multiple first round picks. I mean, look at what the Bears had to give up multiple first round picks just to move up a few spots to get to draft Justin Fields in the back half of the top 15. So, like, if you're thinking about the Giants having to spend capital, these are the decisions Joe Shane's going to have to make. Albatross contracts for guys like Kyler Murray. Will it hamstring us for the long term? Do we give up, draft capital for the future? Where is our team positioned starting in 2023? Knowing that there's still a few games left to play here.
Yeah, and just to clarify it, Houston's the number 1 overall pick. Davis Mills was a nice story. This season hasn't exactly gone according to plan to say, hey, he can be our guy long term. Chicago feels good. Justin Fields now changing the needle, certainly in the last handful of games for himself, in spite of the potential injuries here. Rams, which goes to Detroit, though. So, Detroit, they brought in a young QB there behind Jared Goff. Denver goes to Seattle. Seattle could use that pick, certainly. Carolina obviously needs a quarterback. The Eagles aren't going to need it at 6, getting it from the Saints. But even trading out of it, even teams that don't need QBs in the top half of the draft, there, top 10 picks of the draft, they're still going to say, we want a ton if you want to come get it, right? Green Bay down the line there. Las Vegas, even at 9, could be one of those teams, right? So it's going to be interesting to see which teams say, yes, we're going for a QB or not, and then where it moves from there. The other piece that I want to add into this, and just for clarification, obviously the New York Football Giants right now are 24th in the draft. They're in the wild card round there. So you're talking about, this is very unfortunate, over on Tankathon. They label it as wild card round losers, which feels rude. Like, it can't be. It could be wild card round runner up. That'd be nicer, I think. But they're on that fringe there. If they fall out of it, to your point, teams that are outside looking in, 6-5, Seattle, Chargers, New England, those kind of teams, where they go, what happens with the Colts over these last handful, the Detroit Lions, Pittsburgh, who won their game, obviously. What happens with them will dictate whether or not, if the Giants make the playoffs, that's its own thing. If they don't make it, how high you can potentially rise. The other thing I just want to mention here when we're talking about numbers, you mentioned it there about Daniel Jones, and it's the offseason piece. I'm not, again, we said we want to keep this kind of compartmentalized, But the big money that you commit to a Russell Wilson, who's making the second most money at the QB position this year, $49 million, only behind Aaron Rodgers. And then Kyler Murray is third at 46. Deshaun Watson right behind him there in Cleveland. He's potentially going to play some football eventually. The problem here is, though, I'm just going to state it plain, and the cap always goes up. $25 million? That's what Tom Brady makes this year, and he likes to take discounts. When you move up the list from there, it's Ryan Tannehill making $29.5, and he signed that contract a few years ago. It's Matt Ryan making $30 million. He's a veteran. It's $32 million for Carson Wentz. It's $33.5 for Jared Goff. I just want to paint the picture here that the choice that the Giants have to make, it's not about 20 or 25 million for Daniel Jones. It's going to be about 35 to 40 million for Daniel Jones because that's where the market is. It's just the reality. So if you're starting NFL quarterback, and I'm not saying that my point is only he might be, if you think he's a starting NFL quarterback, whether or not he's a championship, take you on a run in the playoffs quarterback, if you just think that he is a functioning NFL starting quarterback, then you got to start living in the world where you're spending 35 to 40 million dollars on him because there's going to be other guys that are going to come up here. Eventually 2025 is Dak Prescott. Kirk Cousins 2024 is making 35 million right now. And we've had that conversation around it. So all these numbers are going to go up. You have to live in the reality that it's not 25 million. It's going to be much closer to the floor being 35 million for Daniel Jones. And do the Giants want to make that commitment?
Well, the last thing I will say, just keep in mind, we've talked about the transition tag for the Giants. That's at $27 million. That's still in play for them. It's $29 million for the franchise tag. If they decide to get a long-term deal done with Saquon Barkley, then you can use the franchise tag on Daniel Jones while you figure things out. There are a bunch of options in here, but I think we can all agree right now, Daniel Jones is an option for the Giants in 2023. It's all going to come down to price and how they finish the season, knowing that they have so many games left that have huge playoff implications.
And let's talk about that before we get out the door here. And we know, by the way, I kind of knew it. We had a very strong rundown coming into this episode, but we haven't talked since last Wednesday. So it's inevitable that you're going to get a little bit broader and we're going to go a little bit beyond the season, which is something
Pre-show, we're like, man, Russell Wilson stinks. Did you watch that game? We're like, whoa, imagine all that money that goes to these quarterbacks. And like, we weren't even going to talk about that. And all of a sudden we're like, well, what about Kyler Murray, Aaron Rodgers? And then clearly it always comes back to Daniel Jones. It just always does, no matter how much we want to separate it. But, Adam, this week is a huge, huge game for the New York Football Giants. They take on the Washington Commanders, who are hot. They're 6-1 in their last 7 games. And now, Adam, this has massive playoff implications because the Seattle Seahawks, the Washington Commanders, and the New York Giants, as it sits today, looks like if they play musical chairs going into the postseason, one of those teams is going to be without a seat, and this game will go a long way into dictating who is left standing.
Of course, listen, Brian Daboll, the season starts now. Now, we also said this in pre-show. I can debate about whether or not that goes against the grain, kind of what he's preached the entire season. It's game to game. It's week to week. It's always an evaluation. Now you're 7-4. Now you know the fan base really wants this team to make the playoffs symbolically in your first year as head coach and Joe Shane's first year as GM, and the season starts now. If you split the season series with Washington coming up over the next several weeks, you feel pretty comfortable needing to circle one more win on the schedule and at worst hold on to the back end of that third wild card spot. If you lose to Washington, though, then the floodgates start to open up here potentially. And you mentioned Seattle. Seattle this week is going on the road to LA. Guess what? Those LA Rams, they ain't the LA Rams that were winning a championship and hosting Lombardi Trophy last year.
Not good, Adam. They've lost 5 straight.
They are not a good team. So if you think that Seattle is capable of winning their game potentially this week, and they're in the driver's seat to try to make a push for the playoffs, this game, if you were to lose it, all of a sudden you could tumble back to the last wild card spot, holding on there because you lost, as we all know, the head-to-head with the Seattle Seahawks. And then you have to go and look at the schedule and say, where do we go from here, playing Philadelphia, albeit at home, early enough down the stretch where Philly still wants to lock up that number 1 seed, still has the Vikings lurking there a little bit, and then you go on the road to Washington. So, 3 games from now, and then you'll turn around and play the Vikings in Minnesota, who could still be vying for the number 1 seed in a first-round bye. The next 4 weeks here, every single game, man, lose this one to Washington at home, And all of a sudden, it opens up in a pretty dangerous way here for the New York Football Giants over the remainder of the season.
Yeah, basically, if Seattle goes and takes care of the Rams and the Giants falter against the Commanders, all three teams will be 7-5, and the Commanders will have a win over the Giants, and Seattle will have a win. The Giants still have to play the Eagles twice. They have the Commanders again. They have the Vikings, who are leading their division. It is not an easy road, and that's why this game is so important. Because if the Giants win this game and can get to 8-4, you start looking at the rest of the schedule and you're saying, pick off one more. Find me one more where we can feel safe, because we already have one in the pocket against the Commanders. If they win that other Commanders game, they're pretty much in the playoffs at that point. If you get two against the Commanders, you're almost for certain in. If you can sneak one against the Commanders, to your point, hopefully it's this one. Then all of a sudden you look at it and say, are the Colts the team that we think they are? Is Minnesota a team that we can compete against, even though they look really good this year? And I hate to say it, that game against the Eagles, the last game of the season, are they still vying for the number one seed, or do they have everything wrapped up? It becomes a situation where, like, then all of a sudden does Nick Sirianni say, I want to play my players, I want to beat the Giants, I don't want them in the playoffs. There's a lot of paths going on, but it starts with the Giants getting at least one against the Commanders, and you feel like the one at home is the more critical one.
Yeah, and I'm just real quick here on that last game of the season against the Philadelphia Eagles. Again, I love the Giants. I want them to win every game. I want this to be a great season. I want them to make the playoffs. Are we 1,000% sure that the backups for the Eagles can't beat the starters for the New York Football Giants? Because that's a real world thing. And that's a real world thing about really good teams. At the end of the season, they go out, they're going to rest their starters, and then the backups go out and still win that game. Why? Because they're a really good team. When you're a one or two loss team the last week of the season, was that?
I said they're also playing for contracts. You're a backup. You want to show up and show out. Like, who's to say that they're not? The Giants have been winning with backups for half the season, right? So
exactly. Yeah, guys for the Giants have been saying, I'm looking to get paid next year when I go to the free agency market. Real quick too, when you talk about, so just in this playoff picture, Seattle's going to have LA Rams now in LA. They close out their season at home hosting the LA Rams, and the other one for them right after LA this week is going to be the Carolina Panthers the week after. Then they get San Francisco divisional game, probably really going to matter for maybe, depending on where they are there. It's going to be locking up the division or staying in a battle there. At Kansas City, and then at home against the New York Jets, who have, at the minimum, have a very strong defensive unit. And who knows, maybe Mike White is the new heir apparent there. So, but they have, in theory, 3 very winnable games on their schedule, and that gets them to 9. You talk about, obviously, the New York Giants, and can they just get themselves to 9 wins also? When you look at the Commanders, those 2 games are going to be critical. You can make the case that for both these teams, the Giants and Washington, all they care about is beating each other these 2 games and then getting themselves in a position to at least know they're going to make the playoffs. For Washington, it's going to be the Giants, a bye week, the Giants again. And this is why it's kind of nice here, because they will play at San Francisco, Cleveland with Deshaun Watson, we think, and then Dallas at home in a game that could still matter for Dallas and securing the number 1 wild card spot potentially. So it's like, I think both teams are going to end up that way. And the only caveat I'm going to give here, and I know I'm running a little bit long-winded, the other reason why the Giants need this game at home against Washington is because you can spit it any way that you want. That, hey, basically, it looks like it all lines up and you can muddle your way to a playoff spot and not have to worry about it. I mentioned this in the pre-show. Andy balked at it a little bit, and I think justifiably. Like, I think that most fans will say, who cares? This team sucks. Okay. But the Atlanta Falcons are going to play Pittsburgh, the Saints. They're going to have Baltimore, and then they're going to have the Cardinals and Tampa Bay to close out the year. And they're only a 5-win team right now. But if you lose against Washington this week and Atlanta wins, 1 game difference. And now all of a sudden, that tumble-down effect, knowing that you have the Philadelphia Eagles coming up the week after, you lose these next 2 games. By the way, take everything off the table except for this. If you lose 4 out of 5 games, it's not a good vibe, especially when you have Brian Daboll coming in saying the season starts here. And that's a bold proclamation for him to make, understanding where this schedule is. And in a lot of ways, if you're saying the season starts here, then the end of the season could look like, right, when you said the season started, you lost all but 1 game. Like, and that's going to really paint a picture for how this offseason goes for the Giants. I believe they're going to get the couple of wins that they need here. It's just, in some ways, Andy, I think we may reflect back a few weeks from now and say, I wouldn't have hated if the team was a little bit closer to 500 in the first 11 games and then was staying a little bit more competitive in the last 6 games, because this could be a really bumpy road trying to get there.
Adam, at the end of the day, my friend, let's call your shot right now. Do you think the New York Giants make the playoffs?
Oh. Yes. Yeah, I think they do. I think they do. I think the health that you highlighted coming with these injuries, I'm not brimming with confidence, but I think they can and most likely will win this game against Washington. And that really takes a lot of the pressure off for the last 5 games of the season. I think they do get there, but I'm not going to be shocked if they're the last wild card spot as opposed to one of the top.
We started a few weeks back saying, oh, this team is certainly in the playoffs based on the schedule. We said they had to get the 2 most critical games were the Lions and the Texans, and they dropped that Lions game, which
That's all the difference,
all
dude.
of this difference right now. That's the whole point. That one game, if you have that extra win right now, you say split with Washington. Maybe we need one other game somewhere else in the schedule, and you're in the playoffs. At the end of the day, not even
splitting it to 9, they would have been in.
Right? Yeah. I mean, that's the tough part. So, Adam, we have a competitive game coming up against the Commanders. As Dayball said, the season starts right now. The Giants are underdogs at home against those Washington Commanders. Vegas doesn't respect them. Apparently, nobody respects them right now. So we're back to where we should be. The Giants are underdogs going into these games as opposed to the favorites, and I kind of like it that way, to be honest with you.
Right where we want to be, the underdog story that is the New York Football Giants. We'll come back in all week long. We'll talk about Washington. We'll continue to update these injuries and make sure they're all going to be playing for the New York Football Giants and giving them the best chance. And then we'll look at guys like Taylor Heinicke. Hey, the story that just won't go away, the starting quarterback for the Washington Commanders, like we all knew they would be. You get us over on YouTube. You go ahead and get the podcast wherever you get those needs fulfilled. Continue to like, review, subscribe, comment, get in on the conversation with us. Obviously, we'll be back again next time, as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.